I've always been fascinated by unmade Doctor Who stories, the path that was left untaken, the stuff that could have almost been a reality, but none of those intrigue me more than this concept. The idea that the Ninth Doctor could have been the Doctor during the 50th anniversary. Now don't get me wrong, I love John Hurt and his portrayal of the War Doctor. He's one of the finest actors of our generation, and I think it's an absolute privilege that he got to play the Doctor, not least in the 50th anniversary of all things. But there's a part of me that's always yearned for the idea of seeing Christopher Eccleston in that spot. And the fact that it was very nearly the reality makes that even stronger. We all know the story by now, right? Stephen Moffat reached out to Christopher Eccleston to do the 50th anniversary. They talked it over, with Christopher Eccleston eventually declining due to his, at that point, tenuous relationship with Doctor Who, and more specifically, the BBC.
But Christopher Eccleston said no. And that was awful. That was just awful. I was so depressed that day because I'd written most of the script and he was in it and I didn't know what to do.
But at that point, the script had been written with Christopher Eccleston's Doctor in mind, fulfilling that role. And personally, the idea of a fresh off the Time War Ninth Doctor interacting with the 10th Doctor who's trying to put on a happy face and the 11th Doctor who's trying to forget those events entirely has always fascinated me because it would completely change the dynamic of the 50th anniversary. As much as I do love John Hurt's War Doctor, you don't get the immediate sense that he's a man who is in the middle of a war. He's very polite and very sort of introspective. That's not the Ninth Doctor. The Ninth Doctor, I imagine, in this scenario particularly, would be incredibly brash and angry. And that would be really interesting to see against 10 and 11. The War Doctor sees 10 and 11 as those brilliant men that I turn into. I think the Ninth Doctor at that point in his life would look at them and go, you disgust me. Particularly 11, who is trying to forget it. A concept which I don't think the Ninth Doctor would even be able to comprehend, and would be kind of insulted that he was seen as less of a Doctor by his future selves due to actions that he felt at the time he had to take. You've got to remember as well, this is a Ninth Doctor before Rose. This is a Ninth Doctor before he really comes to terms with a lot of his trauma. So this Doctor would not be in the mood for a lot of the other Doctor's more wacky eccentricities. With John Hurt's War Doctor, it comes across more as like an old man being annoyed at his hyperactive nephews. With the Ninth Doctor, I think he would find some of 11's catchphrases particularly insufferable. Now, while I don't unfortunately have the full script of Day of the Doctor with the Ninth Doctor, how awesome would that be? There was a segment of the script released for a charity project called A Second Target for Tommy, which according to the Radio Times was a book released for friends and colleagues of author Tommy Davaband to help him support his fight against cancer. And this was back in 2019. Stephen Moffat is quoted as saying, while novelising Day of the Doctor, I went back through all the many drafts of the script and I found a version of the barn scene Moffat wrote in his introduction. The moment is clearly not Rose Tyler in this draft, and the barn itself has a very different origin, but the other big difference is one that people might get a kick out of. Hope you enjoy. Do please keep in mind this is the roughest of early drafts. In the script the scene proceeds much as it does in the finished episode, down to a lot of the jokes, but key differences reflect the Ninth Doctor's particular idiolect and character. And then I'm going to read this script. I'm not even going to attempt to do Christopher Eccleston's voice. Don't sit on that. Why not? He strides over, grabs her arm. Because it's not a chair, love. It's the most dangerous weapon in the universe. Listen, a very bad thing is going to happen here, and I'm not sure how it's going to work, but I don't think you want to be here when it does, okay? You've got a funny face. You should see the other fellas. I like it, though. Thanks. It's new. Not sure about the ears yet. They just sort of kept going. Now you need to get away from here. You need to pick a direction and just run. You sound clever. Not clever enough to figure out how this thing works. So could you give us some hush? So immediately, you can see some of the similarities with the finished script, but also the fundamental differences here. Something I find really interesting is Stephen Moffat saying that obviously Rose Tyler or Billie Piper wouldn't have been the moment in this draft, which makes me think, who could have been the moment in this version of the story? Perhaps someone later on from the Doctor's timeline. Maybe Martha, or heaven forbid, can you imagine Donna Noble as the moment? Can you imagine a Donna Noble Catherine Tate version of the moment, sparring off with a Time War Ninth Doctor. That's a story in of itself if Big Finish want it. The sass levels would be off the charts, but I digress. Something else I really like about this is all the little references and nods to the Ninth Doctor's actual run. Obviously you get the line about the ears sort of keeping on going and being huge, which is obviously a reference to Rose, where he makes similar remarks. But also, you've got him saying to the moment, you need to pick a direction and just run, which is very reflective of his first words to Rose in Rose, which simply were, run. I'm also curious as to what exactly he means by a different origin story for the barn in Day of the Doctor. I have no idea what that would imply or entail, but I'm curious about it. And you can immediately tell that the Ninth Doctor is a lot more dismissive of people in this instance than the War Doctor was. The War Doctor at least humoured the moment, at least humoured her a little bit more. The Ninth Doctor is just not in the mood to be dealing with any sort of shenanigans right now, and pretty understandably so. Now, unfortunately, that's all we have of the original script for Day of the Doctor featuring the Ninth Doctor, but we do have some quotes from Christopher Eccleston himself on the draft of Day of the Doctor that he was given, and I think his comments are interesting. I'm once again taking this from Radio Times. When the Day of the Doctor came along, I did speak to them, Eccleston told the crowd during a panel at Rose City Comic Con. I didn't feel that what they were asking me to do did justice to the Ninth Doctor, so I said no. They approached me to be in Day of the Doctor, but the BBC had still not apologised to me, he said. I liked Stephen Moffat a lot, I considered it, but it had enormous emotional impact on me what happened on Doctor Who. The virtue of that is that we then got the War Doctor, because if I'd have come back, you wouldn't have gotten the War Doctor. The War Doctor was precisely there because the Ninth Doctor wasn't, Eccleston explained. And John Hurt's a far better actor than me, and that opened up a whole new dimension, so it was a positive thing, really. Now, obviously, I don't have the full access to the Day of the Doctor script that Christopher Eccleston would have received, and I'm not really going to delve into his relationship with the BBC and Doctor Who, because that's a whole other can of worms in and of itself. But I have to say, from that brief excerpt we were given, that early draft that Stephen Moffat released, the Ninth Doctor feels perfectly in character to me. You might disagree, and that's fine, but I do think that the Ninth Doctor would have been absolutely wonderful in this role. In the end, though, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the 50th anniversary we got. Although another part of me will still be annoyed at the BBC for turning down the idea of an older Doctor being the War Doctor instead, particularly Paul McGann's 8th Doctor, kind of implying that they didn't see Paul McGann as a big enough deal for the 50th anniversary, which personally I disagree with.
And I was saying, well, could we use one of the other Doctors? And the BBC were not unreasonably saying, you promised us the Olympics.
And that would have also created a very interesting dynamic, because the 8th Doctor was a happy-go-lucky adventurer like the other two until very recently. In the 50th, the 10th and 11th Doctors kind of separate the War Doctor, specifically because he only existed within the Time War, but with both the 9th and the 8th Doctor, both of them do as much heroic stuff as either of the other two do in their respective runs. So it would have been a lot harder for them to kind of disassociate from their actions during the Time War, which I think would have led to an interesting dynamic either way. And of course those Doctors would ultimately know what the 9th Doctor would go on to do, and perhaps could eventually be reassuring to him that, hey, you work it out in the end. And I think that would have been a really, really nice way of kind of wrapping up the arcs of New Doctor Who. I also think it'd be interesting to see how some of the jokes would have changed in this version of Day of the Doctor, because obviously a lot of the jokes that the War Doctor delivers kind of feel like sort of the classic series poking fun at a lot of the tropes of the new series. For example, him making fun of them pointing the sonic screwdrivers and stuff like that. Some of them would still stay. I imagine you could still get away with him making a remark on the 10th Doctor's penchants for kissing, given that the 9th Doctor himself wouldn't go on to do that until the very end of his life. But a lot of the other jokes I feel like would have to be different for the fact that he's also a New Who Doctor. For example, he also pointed the sonic quite a bit as well. Arguably, he was the one that started doing that. So it'd be interesting to see how those aspects of the script would change in this reality. But what do you guys think about this? Would you have been interested to see a version of the story with the 9th Doctor instead of the War Doctor? Whatever your thoughts are, drop them down in the comments below. This is a different type of video for me, but if you did enjoy it, be sure to give it a like. I really enjoyed making it. Subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you later.